we have the Watershed Compliance Manager for the City of Santa Cruz to speak. He's going to talk about the milestones in the recovery of San Lorenzo River watershed Anadromous salmonids, which means salmon and trout, basically, but there are a whole lot of others. This is Chris Berry. He's a resident of the Bean Creek watershed, so he lives up here in the valley. He's the compliance manager, as I said, and he is generally focused on drinking water source protection, environmental regulatory compliance, gotta obey the environmental rules, natural resource management, and oversight of the Loch Lomond Recreation Area. And I don't know if you know, but the dam in Loch Lomond is considerably higher than it was before and is making some changes in how that all operates. He currently serves as the chair of the county's Fish and Wildlife Advisory Commission, and we have another member of that commission here, and has formerly served on numerous other nonprofit and government boards and advisory bodies. He hasn't just been sitting around enjoying the valley, but he knows a lot about it. Chris, your turn.
It's sure great to be here and see a lot of familiar faces and some new faces as well. I have to give a shout out to Nancy. She called me at like 7:45 and was like, help, Highway 9's closed, and lo and behold, she's here and running a tight ship. Lisa also. Lisa found her way here via, did you come by via Jameson Creek, is that what you said? Yeah, so like true locals, they found their way here on time. The show must go on, so it's great to be here this morning. And now I'll try to focus on my presentation. Yes, I'm gonna, hopefully just if you could give me a signal if I start meandering, that'd be great.
The next one, like maxed out.
Okay, can I just pull it off the stand and, anyway. Okay. Well, I apologize, the title of my presentation may be a little grandiose. I was trying to think of something a little bit more captivating than the City of Santa Cruz Anadromous Salmonid Habitat Conservation Plan. So years ago, I made a video for Sandy Lyden's History of Monterey Bay class that was Milestones in the Extirpation of San Lorenzo River Coho Salmon. But really in the last few years, there's been a lot of good work done, and I want to celebrate the successes and movement toward recovery as much as acknowledge the past. To that point, I think it's great that Lisa went first because she set the stage for the rest of us. So much of the story of the watershed is about the people and the activities that people were involved in over time. I'm going to show a few slides that sort of tee off of what Lisa presented. But we're, in spite of all the nice trees and everything, we're not dealing with a pristine watershed here. We're dealing with really one of the most industrialized watersheds south of San Francisco back in the day, and now a watershed that is loved to death by many people. So that presents some issues in terms of watershed management and anadromous salmonid fisheries conservation. Does everybody know how to pronounce salmonid? I got quizzed on this yesterday, and I said if I can achieve one thing tomorrow, it'll be that everyone knows how to pronounce salmonid. So anyway, I won't embarrass myself and you by having you all repeat after me, but salmonid, not salmonid. Okay. So just a little structure for the presentation here. I do need a little bit of a map, or I will invariably go off on a tangent. So stop me if I do that. A little background. Extirpation milestones. How did we get here? And Lisa talked a little bit about that in much more detail than I will. Again, the 3 L's. If we're downtown, I usually add a 4th L. Lost Boys. There's issues with the river around the 3 L's up here. Lesser so with the 4th L up here, but certainly that's an issue as well. Downtown, the 4th L comes into play a little more. But lumber, lime, leather, those were really big activities in the valley in the 1800s and into the early 1900s. You can see this clipping from the Sentinel by Ernest Otto about how busy the watershed was with industry. I love this, love/hate the picture of the oxen team dragging logs down what's basically the 2-year floodplain of whatever that creek is, and I think it is actually a San Lorenzo Valley tributary. The residential growth occurred all along the creeks. You know, that's where the little flat benches are, where you can fit in on a little carriage road, where you can build a cabin, so everybody's right next to the creeks. As more people came in, they ended up on the hillsides, and then big winters came, and those houses ended up in the river. Water supply, you know, I was glad Lisa presented on the impacts of the powder mill, because long before the city of Santa Cruz was diverting water from the San Lorenzo River, the entire flow of the river every summer was being diverted by the powder mill. So there's a long history of human use and abuse of the watershed that we have to reconcile and try to bring back the watershed and the Anadromous Salmonids that we care about so much. Certainly, the city water supply has been a big issue over time, and I'll get a little bit more into that. We talked a little bit about roads, but climate too. The San Lorenzo, in particular, is pretty warm, and we have more dynamics in our weather these days that, you know, they create. We've had the prolonged droughts, some pretty serious wet winters. These are challenges for our Anadromous Salmonids as well as for all of us that live in the valley. And that's, you know, that's probably not going to get any better in the future, so that's something we're going to need to reconcile. Just a few more pictures of more modern impacts. Whoever this guy is on the top left, if you're in the room, you're my hero. The guy that's confronting the three guys breaching the river mouth. I think that was, I don't know if Jane Neo's here, but I think Jane took that photo. But that's an ongoing issue, folks, breaching the sandbar and really causing some pretty drastic water quality changes in the lagoon when they do that. In 1991, I'm sure it's good to see some folks that were here back in the day, so to speak, because you remember these things. And you fought for the river long ago and set the stage for the rest of us to try to do good work too. But in 1991, we dried up the river. Dawn reminded me of that when I first came on, and I haven't forgotten that. I did look at the data before the presentation, and it's like, yeah, 0.1 CFS in the river is not a good flow for rearing steelhead. There's some more positive news on that later in the presentation, so let's focus on that. But with all the riparian development, we've got people managing wood. We've got septic tanks that are underwater during big flow events, as is this one in the top right. The Stalls Tannery and all the other tanneries had issues. Lots of stories in the Santa Cruz Surf and the Santa Cruz Sentinel about the river turning red with tannins as things are dumped into the river. You know, for folks that, for industry along the river was a convenient way to get rid of the waste, as it is in, you know, all over the planet. So it wasn't any different here in Santa Cruz. But I want to focus more on recovery, and there's been a ton of work that's gone into recovery. You know, really, as we learned with Lisa's presentation, the anti-sawdust folks, you know, good for them, right? They set the stage for those of us today to try to continue that work and protect the water quality for the fish and for water supply downstream. But the county's ordinances have been progressive, and thankfully we have some people in the room that were involved in that stuff. In the 70s, the riparian ordinance is hugely important. The septic ordinances, as all of you know, we have the highest density of septics, I believe, west of the Mississippi here. Somebody correct me if that's wrong. Anyway, we have a whole lot of septics, and again, they're near the creeks and sometimes in areas of high groundwater. Much more well-maintained and managed than they were in the past. But with the population pressure we have, that's going to be an ongoing thing that we need to be mindful of. I won't get into the details on all these, but suffice to say there's been a lot of work gone into protecting the watershed over time. The first watershed plan in the state, and the author of which is sitting here in the audience, which is awesome. Recovery plans, the Coho recovery plan came out in 2012, the Steelhead plan came out shortly thereafter. The Clean Water Act, of course, Fish and Game Code, forest practice rules. One thing I think we often forget about when we talk about watershed protection is the Safe Drinking Water Act. A lot of water agencies in California are groundwater agencies, but for surface water agencies like San Lorenzo Valley and the city, the Safe Drinking Water Act is hugely important. And it's a tool to protect our watersheds, not just for water supply, but also for the critters that live in the watershed. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there's a real opportunity there to find some win-wins for both water supply and public health as well as fisheries. And mostly I want to talk about the Anadromous Salmonid Habitat Conservation Plan today. That's been going on for a long, long time. And we're I'm hesitant to jinx us, but we're very close to actually having a permit, which is a major milestone for that project. So, what is a habitat conservation plan? I hate to make this, to reduce the shininess of the habitat conservation plan term, but it's actually part of a permit. So it's part of a Section 10 permit or Section 2081 permit if you're looking at the state Fish and Game Code. Basically, it's how you will continue to operate whatever you're doing that affects endangered species, but do so in a way that reduces those impacts to the most minor amount possible. And so you can also cover species that are not listed under the Endangered Species Act. We have 2 pre-existing HCPs that have already been approved in the city of Santa Cruz, and one of them involves a lot of aquatic species that are not anadromous salmonids. So they include lamprey and western pond turtle, tidewater goby, and a few others, red-legged frog. But some of those species are not even listed yet. We'll hear later today from Chad Mitchum about the western pond turtle listing proposal. That's kind of a big deal. Hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but really probably one of the biggest things in terms of environmental regulatory evolution of our watershed in a few years. HCPs basically describe the activities that you're getting coverage for with your permit and how you're going to reduce the impacts of those activities. You also are required to show long-term funding assurances. You can't just say, oh yeah, we'll do this, but you actually have to show how you're going to do this in terms of funding it over the long term. The hope is that it will also streamline permitting for other projects. So a lot of what's in our HCPs is stuff that we would, we basically just pulled terms from other permits and put them in the HCP, and then there's a little bit extra conservation where needed. But the hope is that with a long-term 30-year permit, which is what we're looking at, it will streamline permitting processes for other projects. So take, the short story is take is not just killing the species you're concerned about. It may be the case in point, this gentleman who was trying to get a sea otter off his surfboard. That's actually could be considered take. He was filmed by probably 1,000 people doing that. It was all over international news. So I don't think Fish and Wildlife Service is going to be knocking on his door anytime soon. But take is much more than killing the listed species. It's harm, harass, pursue. In our HCP, we've actually spent a lot of time talking about our levels of take with snorkel surveys. So we swim in the streams and we count fish, and the National Marine Fisheries Service wants to know how many fish are we harassing when we do that. Which, then you start to get a little perspective when you think about that, and you're like, okay, if I'm a home builder and the federal government says something like that, that's kind of hard to embrace. Those of us that are fish huggers, we're like, okay, we get it. But if you're someone that doesn't even believe in the Endangered Species Act and someone's like, what, you need take authorization to count fish just swimming in a stream? Anyway, so that's a deep dive into the weeds there of permitting, but just to give you an idea, it's not just about killing fish. And really what's most important in terms of our operations is our effects on habitat, whether it be the flow in the river or the riparian vegetation adjacent to the river. So yeah, we've been working on this since 2001, May of 2001, believe it or not. And I should give a shout out to my former boss, Terry Tompkins, who started consultations with the federal government in the mid-90s when the listing started. So this has been a really long road, and we're approaching a major milestone. So it's good to be able to be here today and share this with you. We're also covering flood control operations in our permit. So a lot of you from the lower rivers see the work on the flood control channel, and our hope is that that will expedite their permitting, but also ensure that the work that they do over the long run is protected by the fisheries to the extent that it can be. So yeah, a little bit late in the presentation to be talking about covered species, but yes, we're talking about coho and steelhead. So coho really is kind of driving things here because they have a much more rigid life history, and they're closer to being, frankly, extinct than steelhead. Steelhead have much more plasticity in their life history, and there's a lesson there, right? Like adapt or perish. But our goal is to make conditions suitable for coho, understanding that the deck is a little bit stacked with climate change and the weather whiplash and water temperatures and whatnot. But we're going to give it our best effort. Plan areas, this entire city water system up to Bonnie Doon and up to Loch Lomond. But I'll share a little bit more later. Our conservation plan actually covers a wider area, because when we do projects to try to offset the effects of our operations, we want to work within more of a biological universe than an infrastructure universe. So we're working within the Central Coast Coho ESU. That's the evolutionarily significant unit. So again, covered activities, a lot getting into the weeds here. Basically all of our city water operations, as well as flood control, including land management, including restoration projects that we'll do as part of this project, including monitoring that we'll do as part of this project. And there's a lot of linkage to the rest of the water operations. We're basically rebuilding the city water supply to try to better avail ourselves of water when it's available in the winter, and then leave water in the streams in the summer and the fall when the fish really need it. We do have some wintertime flow needs as well, but the bulk of our water supply constraints are around the fall and summer flows, as well as our system demand. And then of course there's linkage to our water rights. We really have to amend all of our water rights to make this work. And there's some implications throughout the watershed in that regard. So the bottom line is we want to contribute to recovery. We don't want to just reduce our effects and check the box and say, okay, we've got a permit now, we're off to the races. We actually want to see some return on this. Thankfully, we've actually already seen wild coho reproduction in Laguna. Laguna Creek is right over the hill over there in Bonnie Doon. We're hopeful that will come to the San Lorenzo as well, but it's nice to see some early success there. We're offsetting our effects by doing things like improving flows, but we can't offset all the effects of the city water operations, because basically we have to tell everyone to move out of Santa Cruz. Sorry, there's no water. So we do have remaining effects, and those remaining effects will be offset with our doing restoration work throughout that ESU that I mentioned earlier, through the Non-Flow Conservation Fund, and we'll be working pretty closely with the RCD and others on that. It's kind of neat. We had our kickoff meeting just recently in anticipation of getting the permits completed. So literally on Monday, we're meeting to select the first project that we're going to do next fiscal year. And again, we're doing tons of monitoring. So we worked with Don Alley for years on that, and we're going to expand that monitoring program next year as well. I believe our monitoring program cost is around $16 million over the life of the permit. So we're really not cutting any corners on the monitoring. And just to show you how things have changed, we talked about 1991 drying up the river. In the future, in a similar water year type, we would have a minimum 8 CFS bypass, which if you look at the habitat preference curves and weighted usable area, the amount of habitat you can get with a given flow, you really can't find a peak in the curve for steelhead. You could say 40 CFS is a better flow, but 8 CFS is right at that inflection point in the curve. And also is something that meets that balance of still providing some water supply in dry years, but meeting the needs of rearing fish in the lower river. Similarly, we've doubled the bypass flow at the Felton Diversion to try to improve passage in the gorge and improve spawning and incubation and whatnot downstream. That's really not so much an issue every year, but in dry years, that's pretty important. Again, getting to that point about the Safe Drinking Water Act, our watershed protection focus for the public health purposes is also beneficial for fisheries, so there is a win-win there. And there's an opportunity with the HCP, because you have a long-term, you have a plan, you have dedicated funding, so there's an opportunity to leverage other projects and other pots of funding to do regional conservation planning. So we're looking forward to partnering with the RTC and the RCD and other acronyms that I won't throw out just yet, to try to do more regional conservation work with this pot of money that we've got to do good things with. And really focusing on riparian protection, water quality improvement, and just overall water resources in the watershed. We talk a lot about septic tanks up here in the valley, and folks have a hard time sometimes making the connection with how that affects the river. But the rubber meets the road down in the lagoon, especially when we have elevated nutrient levels. And the lagoon becomes eutrophic, and then it can't support rearing steelhead. That's the most important rearing habitat in the watershed, so we really We have some challenges in the lower river, obviously, because of the flood control work, but we really need to try to make the lower river function better for rearing habitat. And so current status, this is the boring, wonky slide about where are we? We've basically finished environmental review. The Section 10 permit, that's the federal permit, is going to the Section 7 coordinator on Monday. I learned yesterday afternoon. So we've got a draft state permit out for review. As I mentioned, our implementation team is already meeting, talking about projects and future monitoring. And I think this sort of it's a springboard for talking more broadly across the watershed about in-stream flows. Case in point, in our O&M HCP, which covers lamprey and pond turtle and red-legged frog and other species, we do have minimum flows already approved for the river. So, for instance, when other people bring projects forward and they do an initial study through the CEQA process, they have to acknowledge those minimum flows that have been set. So that's really that's something that is not super, unless you're really in the weeds, you don't really recognize the importance of that, but that's actually kind of a big deal. And then again, we're definitely thinking about climate change. We spent literally years looking at various climate models to try to develop a range of potential outcomes in terms of how are the flows going to change in 30 years, and what does this mean to our supply? What does this mean to migration opportunities, and what does this mean to rearing flows in the summer and fall? I think the end result from all that work is we know all of our answers are wrong. But this is statistics, right? You model enough scenarios and you sort of get a general direction, and then you try to provide enough flexibility in your planning so that you can respond to those potential outcomes. And like I said, the in-stream flow improvements are already happening. So here's to 1991 again, a critically dry water year, and this is mean daily flow, so you don't necessarily see how the river was dried up for a few hours on any given day when the demand was high. But in 2020, which, how many of you remember 2020? And wish you didn't. 2020 did have some positive notes, and we kept good flows in the river in 2020 in spite of COVID and terrorist incidents in Ben Lomond and the fire and everything else. We were on furlough too, I think, at the time. I can't even remember. There must have been locusts and whatnot as well. But 2020 was a gnarly year, so to speak, but we did have relatively good flows for a critically dry water year in the Lower River. And just a bit on the conservation fund, the non-flow conservation fund, again, working with the RCD, trying to do restoration projects throughout the CCC, ESU, more acronyms for you, just trying to improve conditions, particularly for coho, so that we can really put money into streams that really are going to generate habitat benefits and have a greater chance of success for recovery. Again, tons of monitoring. I'll probably be back at some future State of the San Lorenzo to tell you more about that. We're learning all kinds of cool stuff and stoked to be partnering with Trout Unlimited and Cal Trout these days, as well as Monterey Bay salmon and trout. Will, who's in the back there, just put in a pit tag reader on Branson 40 Creek, so we're getting to see how fish are moving throughout the system in that regard, and you'll hear more about Branson 40 from Justin in a minute too. So lots of good stuff going on there. And how can you help? Perhaps the most important slide. And probably many of you have ideas that aren't on here, but maintaining your septic systems, leaving stream wood in the streams. I know last year was a little rough for streamside property owners, but there was a lot of log jams removed that perhaps could have stuck around or at least been managed a little bit more effectively. I know county staff really tried really hard to do their best to maintain some habitat in the midst of several emergencies. But with all the folks living along the streams, that's really going to be an ongoing challenge. Teach your children, right? I'm not seeing a lot of young people here today, and granted on a rainy Saturday morning, I probably would have rather watched cartoons when I was little. But does that date me? Anyway, but teach your children. I mean, so we're stoked to have some of the early pioneers of watershed conservation here today, but it's our job, and I see this more as my job increasingly, to sort of help the next generation sort of take the torch and run with it. So I'm hopeful that by continuing to have these events, we can sort of build that literacy and that, bridge the generations and continue this legacy of watershed protection. There's a QR code, because I guess that's what young people do. They aim with cameras. So if you want to look at that QR code, It'll take 5 minutes to download, but that's the draft Anadromous Salmonid Habitat Conservation Plan is there. A link to our watershed programs, and thanks. Yeah.
There is time for questions. So yeah, sure.
So, a few years ago, before we had the wetlanders, at the mouth of the river, bulldozers had built a large wall of sand with some piping. Not there now. It's meant to be temporary. Was it effective, and what did we learn from it?
Okay, so that's the San Lorenzo Lagoon. I'm not sure we actually have an official title for it, but it's a water level control structure. The San Lorenzo, as you saw that slide earlier where people were trying to breach the sandbar. So the river, the sandbar at the river mouth has probably been breached every Friday for over 100 years, if I had to guess. When our team is out there doing seining, we go out on a Friday morning and it's like, oh look, tire tracks right up to where the river's now open, flowing into the ocean. So, and the city has had lots of issues trying to manage safety around the river mouth in the summertime when you have 10,000 people on the beach. That can be a little challenging. So we got a grant from the Wildlife Conservation Board a few years ago to install a control structure that will keep the water levels at about 5 feet, which is sort of a happy medium of amount of inundation and habitat versus the ability to manage the sandbar. So what you were seeing was omelets being made, so to speak, it was a construction project where they also got hit by early rain, which made it very challenging. So they had to build a big wall of sand and put pipes in it. They were trying to bypass, I think, 15 CFS through the work site while they were working. And it was admittedly pretty ugly. So we're hopeful that that project will wrap up this summer and things will be a little bit better as a result thereafter.
Thanks for that update. I wondered too. Sure.
Does the city have a plan to address micropollutants and are you monitoring for it?
My group is not monitoring micropollutants. Our water quality lab is very on top of that stuff. Yeah, the water quality fisheries connection is something that we probably could explore a little further. 6 ppd is another concern. It's a component, what is it? Ryan knows, he did a presentation on it last year. Basically, it's something that keeps tires from breaking down, but it's also found to be incredibly toxic to coho. So microplastics, 6 ppd, probably 20 other chemicals that we're just learning about now. That's something that our water quality lab and the county and the regional water quality control board are pretty on top of. But yeah, I think we're, as we move forward into the future, that's something that we'll always have to keep our eyes on is, this is a developed watershed. How are we going to maintain water quality so it's protective of both public health, but also the fisheries that we're trying to conserve?
Sure.
Chris, here's a big one. Does everyone know what the RHMA is, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment? I'm wondering how you feel about this. I'm a lifelong resident, fisherman, no-kill, and we see the San Joaquin Valley where the aquifers all subsided, yet they plant thousands and thousands more acres of almond orchards. So Santa Cruz has this paradigm that's working, and the state mandated housing allotment that we need to create. I don't ever hear anything about how are we going to water the people living in, what is it, like 3,000 or 5,000 new housing units in the city of Santa Cruz? How do you deal with that in terms of Salmonids?
Well, we have our water rights include an obligation to the bypass flows. So, I'm reticent to get into a discussion about water supply and planning and the state mandated RENA numbers. It's also a little bit ironic. On the one hand, we have the Department of Fish and Wildlife saying, let's put all this water into the stream, and then you have the demand for the housing. But obviously, we all know housing is a challenge in Santa Cruz County. I'm going to decide to not answer that question directly. I'll make a full disclosure, but I will. One thing that I think is good is that most of the housing is focused downtown and not in Boulder Creek, for instance. You know, having a watershed that's undeveloped is really beneficial for fisheries and for water supply, go figure. You know, that balance is something that planners deal with more, and frankly, I'm just grateful that you know, there's some thought going into the development proposals that it is downtown and going vertical, and we can debate all day long about whether 12 stories is okay or whether 18 is better. I'm not going to be part of that debate. I'm just grateful to get some flow in the river and to have some focus on protecting the watershed, so, yeah.
Okay, one more question. I'm sorry, sir. Sorry at first. I know there are others. There may be an opportunity to have a few more questions with Chris.
Yeah, I'll be here after if you
Yeah,
want to catch me.
he'll be
in the hall.
hanging out. Sir.
What's the story on the rubber dam that the city had in terms of having that?
Well, so I talked about that a little bit in my presentation. We increased the bypass flow there. Frankly, we have barely used the rubber dam in recent years, except for trapping for the Monterey Bay Salmon and Trout project. Our water rights project actually moves our use of that water right more to downtown, so that actually keeps more of the river wet, more flow in the river between Felton and Santa Cruz. So we still intend to use that facility from time to time in the future, but we are planning a rehab of the fish ladder. Within 10 years of permit issuance is the language in the HCP. But most of the diversion from the Felton diversion will actually occur down at Tate Street on the edge of Santa Cruz. So that's kind of the current status. If you want to take a deeper dive, I'm happy to talk outside. Yeah.
I'm sorry to cut us off, but we do have some more really exciting speakers. Chris, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.